Some of the scariest horror games of all time might be the ones we never played. At this point in time, the sole mention of PT, the playable teaser for a planned new installment of the Silent Hill series, is sure to make anybody sigh in yearning. Unless you've been living under a rock or in a dark basement chained to the walls, you probably know the history of this peculiar experience. Long story short, a demo for a new horror game was announced on Gamescom 2014 under the title PT, allegedly developed by the non-existent company 7780 Studio. The game later appeared on the PlayStation Network as a free download. What players found was one of the most revolutionary and terrifying horror gaming experiences ever made. It had challenging puzzles, photorealistic graphics in the first person, a gritty atmosphere, and one of the scariest horror villains of all time. But the best part was yet to come. Those who were brave enough to finish the demo were rewarded with an outro cutscene starring Norman Reedus, who walked through a mysterious town just before the music played and the title, Silent Hills, was displayed. Oh my god. Could this be the revival of one of horror's most beloved series? Soon afterwards, it was announced that Hideo Kojima, in collaboration with Guillermo del Toro, was in fact working on a new Silent Hill game that promised to be like nothing we'd ever seen before. This was the bloody wet dream of all horror gamers around the globe. Expectations were growing until the dream, or rather nightmare, just ended. The development for the game was cancelled, apparently due to disagreements between Kojima and Konami's creative team. To add insult to injury, the demo was removed from the PlayStation Network, and it has become impossible to play, unless you never deleted the file from the console, or if you're willing to pay a full month's salary for a console with a pre-installed game. After so many years, over a decade at the time this video essay has been published, PT is still considered as one of the most frightening and original horror gaming experiences of all time. It's safe to say that Silent Hills was the greatest horror game never made. It was only a teaser, but it inspired a whole generation of horror game developers, especially in the indie sector, to try and recreate some of its magic. At present, it has the status of a true legend in the history of horror games, even if most of it only exists in players' imaginations. PT might be the most famous and most heartbreaking instance of a horror video game we never got, but there have been many more titles that we were promised, but never saw the light of day. So let's explore a short history of unreleased horror games, because for every classic that defined the horror genre, there is a lost project that could have changed it entirely. Hello, Spooky here. Spooky games for spooky people. If the algorithm brought you to this channel, heed your call and maybe stay for a while. If you've been here before, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the best horror games we can't play. Either because they were cancelled, the ideas were reworked into a different game, or maybe didn't even pass the pitching stage. If you find this video informative or entertaining at all, please remember to leave a like and subscribe, but only if you think I deserve it. So stay till the end and make your own conclusions. During the mid-90s, a game was released that changed horror gaming forever: Resident Evil. This game is responsible for and even coined the term for what we now call survival horror. The influence that this game had in the horror genre cannot be overstated. No need for introductions really. Resident Evil was a massive success, both critically and commercially. So only 1 month after the original game was released, Capcom started to develop a sequel. And indeed, we got Resident Evil 2, which has come to be one of the most beloved entries in the series. But did you know? We could have got a completely different game. Before Resident Evil 2 was turned into the game we all love, Capcom worked on a prototype for a sequel that has unofficially been called Resident Evil 1.5. Rumor has it the game reached 70 to 80% of completion before it was reworked from scratch. The initial idea for the game was quite similar to the final Resident Evil 2. The story was about a biker called Eliza Walker who looked for shelter in Raccoon Police Station. She was later reworked into our favorite final girl, Claire Redfield. Some non-playable characters were also revamped, most importantly Linda, who later became the iconic Ada Wong. Just like the final game, the prototype was split into 2 storylines where gamers could play as Eliza or Leon S. Kennedy, who, after surviving the carnage at the police station, traveled into the sewers in search of Umbrella Labs. Not much more is known about the story, since a lot of the text in full-motion videos haven't been retrieved. The mechanics were quite similar to Resident Evil 2, but it featured less puzzles. Some of the classic items, such as healing herbs, were instead replaced by medicine vials, and the game also had a more complex armor system. The whole prototype was cancelled and reworked as the release date was approaching, since the producer Shinji Mikami stated the game was no fun. Not one particular element, but everything as a whole. The team also didn't like the fact that the story had virtually no links to the previous game. For this reason, screenwriter Noboru Sugimura was brought as a consultant and, upon reading the script, advised Capcom to restart development completely. Of course, this meant the release had to be pushed back several months. In the meanwhile, Capcom was using material from the prototype as promotional media, which has become vital for fans to try and recreate the game. Whilst the prototype has never been officially released by Capcom, rumors of leaked game builds have been circulating since the 90s. In 2007, however, a partial copy was bought by a private collector and shared online in 2013. This version is often called the 40% build, but it is believed that Capcom still possesses a more complete version of the prototype. Interestingly, the team included a nod to the game in the Resident Evil 2 remake, allowing players to use a costume for Claire that very closely resembles that which Eliza used in the prototype. Still, a proper recreation of Resident Evil 1.5 is still a work in progress by the most dedicated fans. Silent Hills might be the most famous cancelled horror game of all time, but it wasn't even the first entry in the series to get lost into the fog. Silent Hill Cold Heart was a concept pitch in 2007 for the newly released Nintendo Wii. It was actually meant to be one of the launch titles for the console. The story followed a college student called Jessica Chambers who is suffering from nightmares and insomnia, so she decides to visit a psychiatrist. Afterwards, she intends to pay her parents a visit, but she becomes lost in a blizzard and ends up in Silent Hill after following an ambulance. As this was planned to be one of the earliest games for the Wii console, the mechanics tried to make use of the innovative motion controls. But besides the purely technical features, this entry also boasted about being the first true psychological horror game, as an important part of the game's story was tailored after a psychological profile that gamers built throughout the game. When connected to the internet, the game would also broadcast real-world weather reports and news to make the experience more immersive. Quite ambitious for an early Wii title. Most of what we know about this game comes from the leaked pitch document, consisting of 7 pages. The booklet even describes a walkthrough of one of the levels, the lake, which has led some people to believe that a prototype might actually exist. But the pitch was never picked up, and it is believed that one of the reasons was that Climax Studios, the developers, might have overestimated the Wii's hardware, so they implemented mechanics that were a little too advanced for the technology of the time. Whilst the game itself was never realized, the title was reworked into one of the most divisive Silent Hill entries, Shattered Memories. As you may have noticed, several of the aspects from the pitch were implemented in this revival. The Silent Hill wiki mentions several more entries of the series that were never released. Would you like to watch a video exclusively on that? Make sure to leave a comment and let me know if that floats your boat. Condemned is an action horror game that remains a classic of the 7th generation of video games. It was a launch title for the Xbox 360 in 2006 and became one of the best-selling horror titles for the console. A sequel was produced and released 2 years later, and it was overall perceived as a worthy continuation to the original. Now the franchise was in the works to become much more than a video game series. The idea was to create an expanded universe with at least 3 more games and even a feature film. Jason Hall, one of the founders of the game's developer company Monolith Productions, had already mapped a storyline that continued all the way to a 4th entry in the series. However, the 3rd part of the saga was never picked up by any major studio, so the lifespan of the series ended a little too short. Not much is known about the story since the developers haven't really spoken about it, but Jason has expressed interest in reviving the series in any possible way, even as a mobile game or graphic novel. Another planned launch title for the Wii was Sadness. This game was announced in March 2006 for the Nintendo Revolution, which is what the Wii was called before it got its official final name. The developers, Nibris, released a live-action trailer that showed how the game would interact with the console's motion controls. The story was set in pre-World War I Russian Empire, where a character named Maria Lengil is tasked with protecting her son after their train derails from its path. The boy is rendered blind by the accident and soon begins to exhibit strange behaviors. Most of the enemies and scenarios would be inspired by Slavic mythology, including Aliko, a creature who serves as an embodiment of misfortune. Sadness was meant to be a realistic survival horror experience that implemented several innovative mechanics and had a stronger focus on psychological horror rather than gore or jumpscares. It would also probably trigger all content warnings with depictions of narcolepsy and paranoid schizophrenia. However, the most appealing part of it was the visual style of the game, which flaunted beautiful black and white imagery inspired by gothic horror. Nibris also mentioned the game would make the most use of the Wii's motion controls, implementing mechanics such as wielding torches to scare off rats or throw ropes over walls. Players would also pick up items by reaching out instead of simply pressing a button. Other aspects that made the idea attractive was the lack of heads-up displays for greater immersion, or the promise that players would be able to interact freely with the game environment in order to find creative solutions to problems. as well as branching paths affected by the player's decisions. Reportedly, the game was to be released in the second half of 2007, but suspicions began to arise really soon. Several publications started to criticize Nebris for lack of any real evidence of the game's existence. There were no demos, playable builds, gameplay trailers, nor even screenshots. The thought on everyone's minds was that Sadness was nothing more than vaporware. The game was later delayed to 2009, and it was officially stated that Frontline Studios, who was in charge of the programming, were no longer working on the project due to creative differences. Nebris claimed that the game was still in development but in search of a publisher. The truth is, however, that developers didn't keep any of their promises. Adam Arthur Antolsky, one of the game's scriptwriters, insisted in a 2009 interview that some progress had been made, such as a full script and concept designs, but the 3D modeling included only one object, possibly a minecart. He also stated that Nebris' failure to meet deadlines had been due to disagreements in the game's design. Nebris didn't show up at E3 2009 as they had planned, and the game also missed the deadline they had set for that year. Not long afterwards, in 2010, their website closed, and it was confirmed by Arkadiusz Rajkowski, one of the game's music composers, that Sadness was indeed no longer in the works. Nonetheless, the dude was kind enough to release some of the unfinished music to the public. Redwood Falls was a planned sci-fi horror game developed by British company Kuju Entertainment. The title was in the works from 2006 to 2007 and meant to be released for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. A playable demo was released as a way to pitch publishers to the final game, and a video of it was only leaked online until 2009. For a long while, we didn't know much about the game except for what we could see in the demo and some images, as well as the fact that the game had been cancelled due to publishers not wanting to take risks with a new IP. Recently, in 2021, an interview with one of the game's former developers, Ron Ashtiani, revealed some interesting details about the planned release. The game would include very advanced graphical features, such as dynamic body changes and humans morphing into monsters, as well as fully flammable and destructible environments, taking advantage of the Unreal Engine 3, one of the most sophisticated game engines at the time. The story would take place in Alaska, where a police officer witnesses a strange object falling from the sky and crashing in the wilderness. It's not hard to guess, but after the incident, several people would go missing or would start behaving in uncanny ways, as if they'd been infected. Several different really spooky enemies were designed, and the game even was meant to include a multiplayer mode. As you can probably imagine, the game's idea was heavily inspired by the films of John Carpenter. This is because Ron Ashtiani had previously been working on a sequel to the PS2 video game for The Thing. Sadly, the second entry was also cancelled after the developer company, Computer Artworks, went into receivership. Insane was a planned series of survival horror video games meant to be directed by Guillermo del Toro, developed by Volition, and published by THQ. A 30-second trailer was presented at the 2010 Spike Video Game Awards, and del Toro himself announced, "With this new series of video games, I want to take players to a place they have never seen before, where every single action makes them question their own senses of morality and reality." THQ and Volition are equally excited to make this vision of a completely new game universe into a reality. The game, however, never came to be. The actual reasons for the cancellation have never been disclosed, but THQ would file for bankruptcy in 2013, and the game's intellectual rights were completely transferred to Guillermo del Toro. So there's that. It's worth mentioning that this wasn't the first time del Toro had some real bad luck releasing video games. In 2006, according to The Hollywood Reporter, the director was working on another survival horror game to be called Sundown, in collaboration with Terminal Studios. Not much is known about the game, except that it was set in a post-apocalyptic universe where the players would have to fight against zombies. As stated by the man himself, the game would have been similar to Left 4 Dead. In the end, the project was cancelled in favor of 2 different games, and we never heard of Sundown again. At the start of this video, I mentioned that PT, the playable teaser for Silent Hills, was responsible for a lot of independent horror games that tried to capture everything that made it special. One of the very first video games to try and fill the void left by its cancellation was Allison Road. Allison Road was meant to be a spiritual successor to PT, developed by Lilith Games and published by Team 17 for Windows, Linux, and OS X. In 2015, a 14-minute long trailer was released demonstrating the gameplay. The trailer showed the inside of a house and a ghostly female figure smeared in blood at the end of a hallway. Really haunting stuff. The footage, however, was not meant to be used in the final game so as to avoid revealing any details about the story. The game was planned for release in late 2016, but its cancellation was announced on Twitter in June that year. The game's creator, Christian Kessler, stated a few months later that Allison Road was still in development and that he would finish it, all by himself. Unfortunately, no news about this game has been made public since then, and the official accounts on social media have been closed. In 2022, a spiritual successor for Allison Road, yeah, you heard that right, a spiritual successor to a cancelled game, which is itself a spiritual successor to a cancelled game, was released under the name Supernormal. The original model for the Lady Ghost was even used in this reimagining, all with the blessing of Christian Kessler himself. Let me save you some time though, it's not a very good game, and the developer, Hitoride, has been linked to some questionable posts, so maybe stay away. For the last entry on this video, let's talk about one of horror gaming's most anticipated releases, Abandoned. It may be too soon to include this game on the list of cancelled horror games, because even though the developers, Blue Box, have officially stated that the game is in fact being developed, the lack of any updates or evidence of its existence has led the public to assume this is just another instance of vaporware. Abandoned first caught attention in 2021 with its trailer, due to similarities to the PT demo and speculations that Hideo Kojima would be involved in the game. Both Hasan Karaman, the CEO of Blue Box, and Kojima himself denied these rumors. The story is purportedly about a man called Jason who awakes in a dark forest just before realizing he has been kidnapped by a cult, whose leader is apparently his own brother. The game is meant to focus on survival horror mechanics and first-person shooter elements, whilst emphasizing a realistic approach to the genre. Even though the game was announced as an exclusive PS5 title in 2021, the game has since then been delayed indefinitely. What's more, the game's concept, gameplay and design have been changed multiple times. Matter of fact, Karaman seems to have a long history of cancelled projects prior to Abandon, which he claims is due to lack of staff and fan interest. A playable prologue is meant to be released before the main game, but some sources hold that little to nothing actually exists of the game, and that even the prologue is unlikely to ever be released. So it's safe to assume that Abandoned has, indeed, been abandoned forever. So what do you think? Which of these games would you like to have played the most? Or maybe you think it's better that they only exist in our imagination? Sometimes I wonder that myself. Would Silent Hills have been as legendary if the full game had actually been finished? Or is it only perfect because it didn't have the chance to be flawed in the first place? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. I normally play and comment 5 horror games every week, but if this video does well, I'm thinking of focusing more on this type of video essays, lists, or just plain rants. For now, I'll be posting these every Saturday, but hopefully I will be able to dedicate more time to this type of content. This video was published today because you have voted for this topic, so if you'd like to choose what video I should work on next, stay tuned for the polls which will be published every Monday. The poll will only count for 24 hours, so you better catch it on time. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, follow this account if you'd like to see more horror video games. See ya.